The ceremony hall on Vaelthra gleamed with crystalline formations that captured and amplified the light from 3 suns, creating patterns that danced across the assembled crowd like living art. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Blake stood at attention as Prime Minister Zorvok droned through the traditional victory speech, but his mind was focused on military logistics rather than pomp and circumstance. He had come to this world to prevent a war, not to be celebrated as a hero, and the faster he could conclude this diplomatic theater, the sooner he could return to more pressing concerns across the galaxy. And so, Zorvok announced with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested he had been practicing this speech in mirrors, by ancient tradition, we offer our victor any prize from our realm. Gold from our mines, technology from our laboratories, territory from our lands, or companionship from our people. Harrison suppressed a sigh as the crowd murmured with anticipation. He had studied Vaelthran customs extensively during his journey here, which meant he knew this moment was unavoidable. Refusing the prize would be interpreted as an insult that could undo all his diplomatic progress, but accepting something valuable would create obligations he had no intention of fulfilling. Take your time, brave human, Zorvok continued, gesturing expansively toward the assembled nobles who had arranged themselves in what was clearly a carefully orchestrated display. Survey all that Vaelthra has to offer. The nobles were indeed impressive specimens of their species, their skin carrying the luminescent quality that marked high-born Vaelthrans, their movements graceful and precise, their elongated ears adorned with jewelry that chimed softly with each gesture. Harrison could practically feel the collective expectation that he would choose one of them, cementing a political alliance that would benefit Zorvok's administration for generations. Instead, his attention was drawn to the edges of the gathering, where the servants and attendants waited with the patient stillness of people who had learned to become invisible. Most of them kept their eyes downcast, but one figure caught his attention. A young woman tending to the decorative plants that lined the ceremony space, her movements awkward and ungainly, her skin lacking the typical Vaelthran glow. She was, by every standard of Vaelthran beauty, remarkably unremarkable. Her ears were shorter than the elegant points favored by her species, her posture suggested someone who spent their days in manual labor, and her clothing marked her as one of the lowest-ranking servants in the palace hierarchy. The other Vaelthran seemed to look through her as if she were part of the furniture. Harrison, however, had spent years studying alien cultures, and something about her nagged at his memory like a half-recalled song. The way she handled the plants suggested knowledge of their growth patterns that went beyond simple gardening. The careful precision of her movements, despite their apparent clumsiness, spoke of someone consciously suppressing natural grace. And when she glanced up briefly, her eyes held a depth of intelligence that seemed entirely at odds with her humble station. "I have made my choice," Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crystalline hall. The assembled crowd leaned forward with anticipation, several nobles straightening their postures and adjusting their ceremonial garments. Zorvok smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose political calculations were about to pay dividends. Harrison walked across the polished floor, past the arranged display of available prizes, past the nobles who watched with growing confusion, and stopped directly in front of the servant woman who was now staring at him with something that might have been panic. "I choose her," he said simply. The silence that followed was so profound that Harrison could hear the gentle chiming of wine through the hall's crystal formations. Then the whispers began, a susurration of shock and bewilderment that rippled through the crowd like waves through water. "The human has chosen a servant," someone murmured in Vaelthran, apparently unaware that Harrison's linguistic training included their language. "Perhaps he cannot distinguish between our castes," suggested another voice. "Or maybe he has suffered brain damage in battle," added a third, which Harrison thought was unnecessarily unkind. Zorvok approached with the careful steps of someone trying to prevent a diplomatic disaster. "Great warrior, perhaps you would like to reconsider. This servant, while adequate for her duties, is hardly a fitting prize for one who has served our people so magnificently. Are you suggesting she is not part of what Vaelthra has to offer?" Harrison asked, his tone carrying just enough edge to remind everyone present that insulting his choice might constitute an insult to him personally. "Of course not," Zorvok backpedaled quickly. "It is simply that we have so many more, suitable, options available. Harrison looked directly at the servant woman, who was now watching him with an expression of carefully controlled alarm. "What is your name?" "Kithra," she replied in the simple dialect used by lower caste Vailthrans, though Harrison thought he detected more sophisticated grammatical structures underneath the deliberately simplified speech. "Kithra," Harrison repeated, noting the way her ears twitched slightly at his pronunciation. "Do you object to accompanying me as my chosen prize?" She glanced around at the crowd of nobles who were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to poorly concealed disgust. "If it is your wish, honored human, then I am bound by tradition to serve." "Excellent," Harrison said, then turned to address Zorvok and the assembled court. "I thank the people of Vailthra for their generous offer. Kithra will accompany me as agreed." "But surely," one of the nobles interjected, "you would prefer someone more aesthetically compatible with your species. Someone whose beauty could be appreciated across cultural boundaries." Harrison regarded the speaker with the patient expression he usually reserved for junior officers who had made particularly obvious tactical errors. "I appreciate beauty in many forms," he said. "Sometimes the most valuable things are those that others overlook." The crowd's whispers intensified, and Harrison caught fragments of conversation that suggested the Vailthrans were rapidly developing theories about human psychology that were both unflattering and wildly inaccurate. Someone wondered aloud if humans were naturally attracted to inferior specimens, while another suggested that his choice was some form of elaborate insult to their culture. "Perhaps," Zorvok said with the diplomatic tone of someone trying to salvage a situation that had spiraled beyond his control, "we should proceed with the formal transfer ceremony." The next hour involved a series of rituals that Harrison endured with military patience while observing Kithra's reactions. She played her role perfectly, responding to instructions with the appropriate deference while avoiding direct eye contact with the nobles. However, Harrison noticed small details that reinforced his growing suspicions: the way she unconsciously corrected her posture when she thought no one was watching, the brief flash of irritation when one noble made a particularly condescending comment about proper servant behavior, and most tellingly, the way her fingers traced complex mathematical patterns in the air when she thought herself unobserved. "The transfer is complete," Zorvok announced finally. "Kithra now belongs to the human Harrison Blake, to serve as he sees fit." "Belongs is such an ugly word," Harrison said mildly. "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement." As they left the ceremony hall, Harrison noticed that Kithra walked exactly 2 steps behind him and slightly to the left, which was the traditional position for a high-ranking bodyguard, not a servant. When he deliberately slowed his pace to test his theory, she unconsciously matched his rhythm with the precision of someone trained in formal court protocols. "Kithra," he said quietly as they approached the guest quarters that had been assigned to him, "are you familiar with ancient Vailthran poetry?" She stumbled slightly, catching herself with reflexes that were far too quick for someone supposedly clumsy. Poetry is not for one such as myself, honored human." "Pity," Harrison replied, reciting in perfect classical Vailthran, "in quantum fields where starlight bends, consciousness and matter blend, what seems apart joins at the end." Kithra stopped walking entirely, her carefully maintained composure cracking for just a moment before she remembered her role. "You speak the old tongue." "Among other things." That particular verse was published 3 years ago in the Interstellar Journal of Theoretical Physics under the name K. Rel. Brilliant work on consciousness as a quantum field phenomenon. The mask slipped completely for an instant, and Harrison saw her true self, brilliant, regal, and absolutely terrified. Then she pulled the disguise back into place like someone drawing a cloak around themselves. "I do not know what you speak of, honored human. I am only a simple servant." Harrison activated the privacy screen on his quarters entrance, ensuring their conversation could not be overheard. "Princess Lireleth," he said quietly, "I know exactly who you are, and I know why you're hiding. The question is, are you ready to stop running?" The woman who had been calling herself Kithra stared at him for a long moment, her disguise wavering like heat shimmer in the space between them. Finally, she spoke in the cultured accent of Vailthran royalty, how long have you known? I suspected from the moment I saw you in the ceremony hall. I've been studying your published research for months. Your theories on quantum consciousness could revolutionize how we understand sentient artificial intelligence. When I saw you making calculations in the air during the ceremony, I knew for certain. And you chose me anyway? Even though it means you'll be drawn into the political crisis surrounding my disappearance. Harrison smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure he'd shown since arriving on Valethra. Princess, I didn't choose you despite who you are. I chose you because of who you are. Now, shall we discuss how we're going to get you safely away from here before Zorvok realizes what he's lost? For the first time since he'd met her, the princess smiled back, and even through her disguise, Harrison could see the brilliant mind that had captivated him through her research papers. I think, she said, this arrangement might indeed be mutually beneficial. Outside their quarters, the three sons of Valethra continued their eternal dance, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to promise adventures yet to come. The transport ship Stellar Meridian hummed through hyperspace with the steady rhythm of a vessel designed for long-haul diplomatic missions, though Harrison suspected their current journey was unlike anything in the ship's official logs. He sat in the observation lounge, ostensibly reviewing tactical reports while actually watching Kithra struggle with the most basic challenge of her disguise, pretending not to understand the ship's navigation displays. The quantum matrix seems inefficient, she muttered under her breath, then caught herself and added more loudly, I mean, the pretty lights are very confusing to a simple servant like myself. Harrison bit back a laugh. The navigation systems are indeed quite complex. I'm sure they're far beyond what you would have encountered in the palace gardens. Oh yes, very beyond, Kithra agreed, her eyes tracking the hyperspace calculations with obvious fascination despite her attempt to appear bewildered. Though I do wonder why the quantum field resonance appears to be fluctuating in pattern 77 alpha when optimal efficiency would require pattern 77 beta. I have no idea what that means, Harrison replied truthfully, but you might want to work on maintaining your cover story. Kithra's cheeks flushed with the faint luminescence that betrayed her emotional state, another detail she hadn't quite learned to suppress. Apologies, honored human. Sometimes I speak nonsense when I am nervous. Quantum mechanics is hardly nonsense, especially when you're describing real problems with our navigation efficiency. Should I be concerned about our ship's performance? Before Kithra could answer, the ship's communication system chimed with an incoming message. The holographic display activated to show Captain Torres, the Stellar Meridian's commanding officer, her expression carrying the kind of professional concern that suggested their journey was about to become more complicated. Colonel Blake, she said, we're receiving a priority transmission from Valethra. Prime Minister Zorvok wishes to speak with you personally. Harrison exchanged a quick glance with Kithra, whose disguise had suddenly become considerably more rigid. Put him through, Captain. The display shifted to show Zorvok's elaborately decorated office, the Prime Minister himself wearing the kind of smile that suggested he was about to deliver news he expected would be unwelcome. Colonel Blake. I trust your journey is proceeding smoothly. Quite smoothly, thank you. Is there something you need? Actually, I'm calling with rather exciting news. It seems there has been a development regarding your prize. We have received word that Princess Lireleth, who has been missing for several months, was spotted in the palace grounds around the time of your departure. Kithra went absolutely still beside Harrison, though she maintained her servant's posture with admirable discipline. Harrison kept his expression carefully neutral. How interesting. I hope she is found safely. Indeed. However, this raises some concerns about the servant you selected. You see, there are suggestions that this Kithra person may have been involved in concealing the princess's whereabouts. Some even whisper that she might have been working as the princess's accomplice in avoiding her arranged marriage to Captain Vex Mardonian. Captain Mardonian? Harrison repeated, though he was quite familiar with the warlord's reputation from intelligence briefings. A distinguished military leader from the Zirian system. He has been most patient regarding the princess's reluctance, to fulfill her family obligations. In fact, he has volunteered to help search for her personally. Harrison felt Kithra's tension increase, though she gave no outward sign of distress. I see. And what does this have to do with my chosen companion? Well, if this servant has been involved in treasonous activities, it would hardly be appropriate for her to serve as a prize for Vaelthra's honored ally. We would be happy to exchange her for someone more suitable to your station. That's very generous, Harrison said carefully, but I'm quite satisfied with my choice. Besides, if there are legal questions about Kithra's status, surely those should be resolved through proper channels rather than by arbitrarily changing the terms of our agreement. Zorvok's smile became noticeably strained. Of course, Colonel. Though I should mention that Captain Mardonian has expressed particular interest in questioning this servant about the princess's disappearance. Perhaps it would be simpler if we arranged for her return so these matters could be clarified. I'm afraid that's impossible, Harrison replied with the tone of finality he usually reserved for subordinates who were pushing the boundaries of military protocol. The formal transfer ceremony was completed according to your customs. Any attempt to reverse it now would constitute a breach of Vaelthran law and interplanetary treaty. The Prime Minister's expression flickered between diplomatic courtesy and barely concealed frustration. Naturally, we would not wish to create any legal complications. However, if this servant's presence on your vessel becomes problematic, please do not hesitate to contact us for assistance. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you for your concern. The communication ended, leaving Harrison and Kithra alone in the observation lounge. She remained in her servant's posture for several seconds before finally relaxing enough to speak. Captain Mardonian is looking for me personally, she said, her voice carrying harmonics of barely controlled fear. That means Zorvok has told him who I really am. Which explains why they're so eager to get you back. A runaway princess is a political embarrassment, but a runaway princess who's been hidden by a servant could be spun as a kidnapping that justifies more aggressive action. Kithra nodded, her disguise shimmering slightly as her emotional control wavered. Mardonian has been pursuing this marriage alliance for years. He believes that wedding me will give him legitimate claim to Vaelthran territory and resources. And Zorvok supports the marriage because Mardonian has promised him continued power as regent while I'm adjusting to married life in the Zirian system. Which, given Mardonian's reputation for disposing of inconvenient wives, could be quite a long regency indeed. Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering their options. So we have a corrupt prime minister, a murderous warlord, and a missing princess who's supposed to be dead or disappeared but is actually sitting in my ship's observation lounge discussing quantum mechanics. When you put it like that, it sounds almost manageable, Kithra said with a weak attempt at humor. Oh, it gets better. We're currently en route to a space station where we'll need to transfer to a different ship for the journey to Earth. Care to guess which space station serves as Captain Mardonian's primary base of operations? Kithra's skin went completely pale, her natural luminescence fading to almost nothing. Nexus Station. Nexus Station, Harrison confirmed. Though I suspect by the time we arrive, it will no longer be a routine fuel stop. The ship's communication system chimed again, and Captain Torres appeared on the display with an expression that confirmed Harrison's suspicions. Colonel, we're receiving multiple transmission requests from vessels requesting permission to escort us to Nexus Station. The requests are unusually insistent. How many vessels? 17 at last count, sir. All flying Zirian military flags. Harrison looked at Kithra, who was now gripping the arms of her chair with enough force to leave impressions in the metal. Captain Torres, please set course for Nexus Station as planned. And prepare the ship for what might be a very interesting diplomatic encounter. Understood, Colonel. Should I alert the crew to potential combat situations? Let's call it enhanced readiness protocols. And Captain? Make sure our guest quarters are prepared for absolute privacy. We may need to conduct some very confidential negotiations. As the communication ended, Harrison turned to Kithra with an expression that was half grim determination and half anticipatory excitement. "Princess, I think it's time we discussed exactly how good you are at strategic planning." "Why do you ask?" "Because we're about to play a very high-stakes game with some very dangerous people, and I suspect we'll need every advantage we can get. Including the insights of someone who's been published in the Interstellar Journal of Theoretical Physics." For the first time since Zorvok's call, Kithra smiled with something approaching her natural confidence. "Harrison, you may be surprised by what a simple servant can accomplish when properly motivated." "I'm counting on it," Harrison replied, watching her disguise flicker as her true personality began to assert itself. "Now, let's figure out how to outmaneuver a warlord and save a kingdom while making it look like we're just having a routine diplomatic meeting." Outside the observation lounge's viewport, the stars stretched into lines of light as the stellar meridian continued its journey toward what would undoubtedly be the most challenging negotiation of Harrison's career. Nexus Station materialized around them like a mechanical galaxy, its rotating sections and docking bays creating a complex dance of lights against the star field. Harrison stood in the stellar meridian's observation deck, ostensibly admiring the engineering marvel while actually counting the 17 Xerian military vessels that had arranged themselves in what could generously be called a welcoming formation and more accurately described as a blockade. "Quite a reception committee," he observed to Kithra, who was maintaining her servant's posture while her eyes tracked the tactical positions of the surrounding ships with obvious expertise. "Captain Mardonian has always favored overwhelming displays of force," she replied in her carefully cultivated simple dialect, though Harrison noticed she had unconsciously begun calculating intercept vectors. "He believes intimidation is more efficient than negotiation." "In that case, he's about to learn something interesting about human psychology. We tend to get stubborn when people point weapons at us." The ship's communication system activated with the kind of official chime that usually preceded either important announcements or significant problems. Captain Torres appeared on the holographic display, her expression carefully neutral in the way of career officers who had learned to mask their opinions about political complications. "Colonel Blake, we're being hailed by the command vessel of the Xerian fleet. Captain Mardonian requests permission to come aboard for what he describes as a courtesy meeting." "How courteous of him," Harrison replied dryly. "Please inform Captain Mardonian that I would be delighted to meet with him in the station's diplomatic quarters. I'm sure he'll understand that protocol requires such meetings to take place on neutral ground. He's insisting on meeting aboard our vessel, sir. He claims it's a matter of personal security." Harrison felt Kithra tense beside him, though she maintained her servant's posture with remarkable discipline. "I see. In that case, please inform the good captain that I appreciate his security concerns, but I have security concerns of my own. I'll be happy to meet him on the station, accompanied by my chosen companion and appropriate diplomatic staff. Sir, he's quite insistent. And his fleet is in a position to enforce his preferences." "Captain Torres," Harrison said with the tone he usually reserved for explaining tactical realities to overly aggressive junior officers, "are you suggesting that we should surrender to the demands of a foreign military force while operating under diplomatic immunity in neutral space?" The captain's expression shifted to something that might have been relief. "Certainly not, sir. I was simply ensuring you were aware of all relevant factors." "Understood. Please inform Captain Mardonian that we'll meet him on Nexus Station in 2 hours. That should give him adequate time to arrange appropriate security for such an important diplomatic encounter." As the communication ended, Harrison turned to find Kithra watching him with an expression that was no longer entirely consistent with her servant's disguise. "You do realize he'll try to take me by force the moment we're in the same room?" "Probably. Which is why we're not going to give him that opportunity." Harrison activated his personal communication device and began composing a message. "Tell me, Princess, how familiar are you with interstellar law regarding diplomatic immunity and the protection of chosen companions?" "Reasonably familiar." "Why?" "Because we're about to give Captain Mardonian a very expensive education in the legal complexities of interplanetary politics." 2 hours later, Harrison walked into Nexus Station's primary diplomatic suite with Kithra maintaining perfect servants protocol 2 steps behind and to his left. The room had been designed to accommodate multiple species, with adjustable atmospheric controls and furnishings that could be modified for various physiological requirements. Currently, it was configured for human and Veilthran comfort, which meant the lighting carried the warm golden quality that both species found pleasant and the gravity was set to Earth normal. Captain Mardonian was already present, flanked by 6 armed guards wearing the kind of ceremonial armor that managed to be both ornamental and functional. He was an impressive specimen of Veilthran physiology, tall and imposing with the enhanced musculature that came from genetic modifications designed for combat effectiveness. His ears bore the ritual scars that marked him as a veteran of multiple campaigns, and his skin carried the subtle metallic sheen that indicated cybernetic enhancement. "Colonel Blake," he said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator acknowledging a potential rival. "I am honored to meet the hero of Xerion Prime." "Captain Mardonian," Harrison replied with exactly the degree of courtesy required by diplomatic protocol and not one iota more. "Thank you for taking time from your duties to meet with us." Mardonian's eyes immediately focused on Kithra, and Harrison saw the moment when recognition flashed across his features. To his credit, the warlord managed to maintain his diplomatic composure, though his hands clenched slightly at his sides. "And this is the servant you chose as your prize? How interesting. She seems familiar somehow." "I'm sure you meet many servants in your travels," Harrison replied blandly. "Kithra has been quite helpful during our journey." "I'm certain she has. In fact, I believe she might be even more helpful in answering some questions about recent events on Veilthra. Perhaps she could join me for a private conversation." Kithra maintained her servant's posture, eyes downcast, though Harrison noticed her breathing had become carefully controlled in the way of someone managing fear through discipline. "I'm afraid that's impossible," he said. "As my chosen companion, Kithra falls under diplomatic protection. Any questioning would need to go through proper legal channels." Of course, Mardonian agreed with the kind of smile that suggested he was enjoying himself. "Though I should mention that I have reason to believe this servant may actually be someone quite different from who she claims to be." "Really? How intriguing. Do you have evidence to support this suspicion?" "I have reliable intelligence suggesting that the missing Princess Lireleth may have been disguising herself as a palace servant. If this proves to be true, then your prize is actually a fugitive from Veilthran justice." Harrison appeared to consider this possibility with the grave attention it deserved. "That would indeed be a serious matter. However, I'm curious about the legal implications. If someone is wrongfully accused of being a fugitive, what recourse do they have under interplanetary law?" "I'm not sure I follow your meaning." "Well, if you were to take custody of my legally chosen companion based on unsubstantiated accusations, and those accusations proved false, what would be the penalty for unlawful detention of someone under diplomatic protection?" Mardonian's expression shifted slightly, suggesting he hadn't considered this particular legal complexity. "I'm sure any misunderstanding could be resolved quickly." "I'm certain it could. Though I believe the penalty for unlawful detention in this case would be substantial. Captain Torres, you have more experience with interplanetary law than I do. What are the typical damages for violating diplomatic immunity?" Captain Torres, who had been standing quietly near the room's entrance, consulted her data pad with obvious relish. "According to the Galactic Convention on Diplomatic Relations, unlawful detention of a diplomatic companion carries a penalty of no less than 50 million standard credits, plus additional damages for emotional distress and violation of sovereign rights." 50 million, Harrison repeated thoughtfully. "Plus additional damages. That seems quite reasonable for such a serious violation." Mardonian's composure was beginning to show cracks. "Surely you're not suggesting that I would act without proper legal authority?" "Of course not. I'm simply ensuring that all parties understand the potential consequences of any misunderstandings that might arise. Tell me, Captain, do you have a legal warrant for the detention of my companion?" I have the authority to investigate matters of Valetheran security. That's not the same thing as a warrant. Captain Torres, what documentation would be required for a foreign military officer to detain someone under diplomatic protection? A formal extradition request approved by both governments involved, plus evidence sufficient to convince a neutral tribunal that the charges have merit, Torres replied with obvious satisfaction. And do you have such documentation, Captain Mardonian? The warlord's jaw tightened perceptibly. The situation is more complex than simple legal procedures can address. I'm sure it is, Harrison agreed sympathetically. Legal procedures can be quite inconvenient when you're trying to kidnap someone. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the station's environmental systems. Mardonian's guards shifted slightly, their hands moving closer to their weapons, while Captain Torres casually adjusted her position to provide better tactical coverage of the room's exits. Colonel Blake, Mardonian said finally, his voice carrying undertones that suggested his patience was approaching its limits, perhaps we could discuss this matter more privately. I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to conduct all diplomatic business in the presence of witnesses. It helps prevent misunderstandings. Very well. Let me be more direct. I have 17 warships surrounding this station. I could take your companion by force and sort out the legal complications later. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. You certainly could try. Though I should mention that threatening a diplomatic mission constitutes an act of war under interplanetary law. Captain Torres, what's the standard response to such threats? Immediate notification of all relevant governments and military commands, plus activation of mutual defense treaties, Torres replied with the tone of someone reciting well-memorized procedures. In this case, that would include the Earth Defense Force, the Valetheran Royal Navy, and the Galactic Peacekeeping Authority. How interesting, Harrison observed. I imagine 17 ships might seem impressive until they're facing 3 different fleet commands with orders to protect diplomatic missions. Mardonian stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he turned his attention back to Kithra, who was still maintaining her servant's disguise despite the escalating tension. You, he said directly to her, what is your real name? Kithra raised her eyes to meet his gaze, and for just an instant, Harrison saw her true personality shine through the disguise. My name is Kithra, honored captain. I am a servant in the palace gardens, and I am now companion to Colonel Blake under the laws of Valethera and the protection of interplanetary treaty. And you deny any knowledge of Princess Lyriletha's whereabouts? I know only what any palace servant would know, that the princess disappeared some months ago, and that many people have been searching for her without success. Mardonian studied her face intently, looking for any crack in her composure. You speak very eloquently for a garden servant. I have had excellent teachers, Kithra replied with perfect humility. The standoff continued for several more minutes, neither side willing to back down completely. Finally, Mardonian stepped back with the expression of someone who had decided to postpone rather than abandon his objectives. Very well, Colonel Blake. I will respect your diplomatic status, for now. However, I should warn you that this matter is far from resolved. I'm sure it isn't, Harrison agreed pleasantly. Thank you for such an enlightening meeting, Captain. I hope your return journey is uneventful. As Mardonian and his guards filed out of the diplomatic suite, Harrison noticed that Kithra was trembling slightly with the aftereffects of sustained fear and adrenaline. He waited until they were completely alone before speaking. That went better than expected, he said quietly. He knows exactly who I am, Kithra replied, her disguise finally beginning to crack under the strain. And he's not going to give up just because of legal technicalities. No, he's not. Which is why we need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out a more permanent solution to this problem. Where could possibly be safe from someone with 17 warships? Harrison smiled with the expression of someone who had been anticipating this question. Earth, Princess. I think it's time you met some people who might be very interested in your research on quantum consciousness. As they prepared to leave Nexus Station, Harrison reflected that his simple diplomatic mission had evolved into something considerably more complex. But watching Kithra gradually drop her servant's disguise as they moved towards safety, he found himself thinking that some complications were worth the trouble. The journey to Earth took 8 days through hyperspace corridors that Harrison had specifically chosen for their complexity, ensuring that any pursuit would face significant navigational challenges. By the 3rd day, Kithra had abandoned her servant's disguise entirely except during official communications, and Harrison found himself constantly amazed by the brilliant mind that had been hidden beneath the carefully crafted persona of Palace Gardener. The quantum resonance patterns in Earth's artificial gravity network are fascinating, she observed, studying the ship's sensor readings as they approached the Sol system. I've never seen such elegant integration of consciousness-responsive technology. Most humans don't realize the gravity systems adapt to our psychological states, Harrison replied, watching her analyze data with the focused intensity that had made her research papers required reading in advanced physics courses. The technology was developed during the early colonial period, when extended space travel was causing psychological disorders. But the mathematical elegance of the solution is remarkable. The gravity fields aren't just responding to individual consciousness, they're creating a harmonized field that promotes collective psychological stability. She paused, looking up from her calculations with excitement that made her natural luminescence flicker like starlight. Harrison, this could revolutionize how we approach interspecies cooperation. If consciousness can be harmonized through quantum field manipulation, you could create environments where different species naturally understand each other better, Harrison finished, recognizing the implications immediately. Exactly. The cultural barriers that make interspecies relationships so difficult might be reducible to quantum field incompatibilities. With the right modifications, we could create spaces where Veilthran harmonic communication and human verbal patterns achieve natural synchronization. Harrison smiled, watching her mind work through the possibilities with the kind of intellectual excitement that transformed her entire demeanor. Is that something you'd like to research further? Are you offering me laboratory access? I'm offering you a full research position with the Earth Institute for Xenological Studies. They've been trying to recruit you for years based on your published work, though they assumed K. Tyrell was male. Kithra stared at him, her disguise completely forgotten as she processed this unexpected opportunity. But I'm a fugitive princess with a warlord hunting me across multiple star systems. How could I possibly? You're also a brilliant scientist whose research could change how species interact throughout the galaxy. The Institute has resources and political connections that make Captain Mardonian's threats considerably less relevant. Before she could respond, the ship's communication system activated with the familiar chime of incoming priority transmission. Captain Torres appeared on the display, though her usual composed expression carried undertones of barely suppressed excitement. Colonel Blake, we're being hailed by the Earth Defense Force. Fleet Admiral Chen wishes to speak with you personally. Put her through, Captain. The display shifted to show a woman in her 60s wearing the insignia of the EDF's highest command, her expression carrying the kind of focused intensity that suggested important decisions were being made in real time. Colonel Blake, she said without preamble, I've been reviewing your mission reports from Veilthra with considerable interest. Particularly the sections regarding your chosen companion and the political complications surrounding her identity. Harrison felt Kithra tense beside him, though she maintained her composure with admirable discipline. Admiral Chen, I trust the reports were complete and accurate. Oh, they were quite thorough. Thorough enough that I've been having some very interesting conversations with people who are extremely interested in meeting Dr. K. Tyrell. The Admiral's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. Or should I say, Princess Lireleth. Admiral, I'm not sure what you're implying, Colonel, I've been in military intelligence for 40 years. When a decorated officer chooses an apparently unremarkable servant as his prize and then defends her against the threats of a known warlord, I tend to investigate the circumstances. Imagine my surprise when facial recognition analysis revealed that your companion is one of the most sought-after theoretical physicists in known space. Kithra stepped forward, her royal bearing finally asserting itself completely as she abandoned any pretense of disguise. "Admiral Chen, I am indeed Princess Lireleth of Vaelthera, and I am seeking asylum with the Earth government." "Your Highness," the Admiral replied with the kind of formal courtesy reserved for important diplomatic moments, "the Earth government would be honored to grant you asylum. However, I should mention that we've received some rather aggressive communications from Captain Mardonian regarding your status." "What kind of communications?" Harrison asked. "Threats, mostly. He's demanding your immediate return to Vaelthran space for trial on charges of kidnapping and treason. He's also suggested that Earth's refusal to cooperate might have unfortunate consequences for future diplomatic relations." Kithera's luminescence flickered with anger. "Mardonian has no legal authority to make such demands. He's not even a Vaelthran citizen, he's a mercenary warlord whose only claim to legitimacy comes from his alliance with Prime Minister Zorvok. Which brings me to some rather interesting news," Admiral Chen continued. "It seems that during your absence, certain evidence has come to light regarding Prime Minister Zorvok's financial arrangements with various criminal organizations. The Vaelthran Royal Council has voted to remove him from office and restore direct royal authority." "Meaning?" Harrison asked, though he suspected he knew where this was heading. "Meaning that Princess Lireleth is no longer a fugitive from justice, but rather the rightful heir to a throne that has been illegally occupied. The new Vaelthran government has formally requested her return to assume her royal duties." Kithera sank into the nearest chair, her expression cycling through surprise, relief, and something that might have been dismay. "They want me to come back and be queen." "It would seem so. Though I should mention that they've also expressed interest in establishing a permanent research exchange program with Earth, particularly in the field of consciousness-responsive technology. Apparently, someone has been sharing your theories about quantum harmonization of interspecies communication." Harrison looked at Kithera, recognizing the conflict playing out across her features. "You don't want to go back." "I want to do my research," she said quietly. "I want to explore these quantum consciousness theories without having to worry about political assassinations and arranged marriages. I want to work with people who understand the science rather than just the strategic applications." "And you want to work with someone who saw through your disguise because he'd read your papers, not because he was looking for a political prize," Harrison added gently. "That too," she admitted with a small smile that made her natural luminescence flicker like candlelight. Admiral Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. "If I may suggest a solution. The proposed research exchange program would require a permanent Vaelthran representative on Earth to oversee collaborative projects. Someone with both royal authority and scientific expertise would be ideal for such a position." "You're suggesting I could serve as both queen and researcher?" "I'm suggesting that modern interplanetary politics allows for considerable flexibility in how royal duties are fulfilled. A queen who advances her people's interests through groundbreaking research while building alliances with other species might be more valuable than one who simply sits on a throne." Kithera looked at Harrison, her expression carrying a question she didn't quite know how to ask. "And what about you? Do you have opinions about quantum consciousness research and interspecies cooperation?" "I think," Harrison said carefully, "that I've learned more about both subjects in the past few weeks than I ever expected to. I also think that someone who chooses to disguise themselves as a servant in order to avoid an unwanted marriage might have some interesting insights about the difference between duty and choice. Even if that someone comes with rather complicated political baggage. Princess, I chose you when I thought you were a simple servant with an interest in gardening. The fact that you're actually a brilliant physicist who could revolutionize interspecies relations just makes the choice more interesting." Admiral Chen's expression softened into something approaching genuine warmth. "In that case, might I suggest that Earth would be honored to host both the new Vaelthran research program and its distinguished director? I believe we could arrange suitable accommodations for someone who needs to balance royal responsibilities with scientific pursuits." "And Captain Mardonian?" Kithera asked. "We'll discover that threatening Earth's diplomatic guests is significantly more expensive than he anticipated. The Galactic Council takes a dim view of mercenary warlords who interfere with legitimate scientific cooperation. As the communication ended, Harrison found himself sitting across from a woman who was no longer disguised as a servant, no longer hiding from political enemies, and no longer constrained by the expectations of people who couldn't see past her royal title to the brilliant mind beneath. "So," he said, "ready to change the universe through quantum consciousness research?" "Only if you're ready to help," she replied, her smile carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly with something deep in his chest. "I have a feeling that the most interesting discoveries happen when people from different worlds learn to understand each other." "In that case," Harrison said, reaching across the space between them to take her hand, "I think we're going to make some remarkable discoveries." Outside the ship's viewport, Earth grew larger in their field of vision, blue and green and beautiful in the way that all homes looked when approached with the promise of new beginnings. And in the observation lounge, two people from different worlds prepared to build something that had never existed before, a love story written in the language of quantum mechanics and measured in the currency of interstellar understanding.